Winter had just set in. The first consul repaired to St. Quentin for the purpose of visiting the works of the subterranean canal, which was intended to unite the river Oise with the Scheldt, of which he was contemplating the completion. The Director General of Highways, as well as Messieurs Monge, Bertelier, and Chaptal, attended him on the occasion. Great damage had been occasioned by the abandonment of the works. Fresh expenses were called for to an enormous amount, and the statements made by competent judges created some hesitation as to the course to be adopted. There were doubts whether it would be proper to prosecute the excavations already made, or whether a lower tunnel should be cut in a different direction. The first consul was determined to see everything with his own eyes, and discovered, in fact, that an undertaking commenced on so bad a plan could never be successful. He abandoned the defective excavations and ordered that the canal should receive the new direction which it now has. The vault under which it runs is much shorter than the one which was at first contemplated. France is therefore indebted to the first consul for this canal, which is the source of so great profit to the northern departments. On his return from St. Quentin, he found at the Tuileries General Bellavine, who brought him the treaty of peace which Joseph had just signed with M. de Cobencel. The stipulations were the same as at Campo Formio, and the renewal of such terms proves that no rancorous feeling lurked in the breast of the first consul. The beaten generally pay the forfeit. Not so, however, in this case. The Austrians resumed their limits as marked out at Campo Formio. The first consul hastened to ratify his brother's work, and the news of the conclusion of peace was forwarded in every direction with the utmost dispatch. Some months afterwards, Austria named as its accredited ambassador to Paris Count Philip de Cobencel, the plenipotentiary's brother, and France sent to Vienna with the same title. Monsieur de Champigny, who was at this time a councillor of state, was created Duke of Cavour at a late period. Peace was hailed throughout France with transports of joy. It eased the public mind, revived its long-banished hopes, and confirmed the restoration of tranquility in the western provinces. A suspicion was never entertained for a moment that evil councillors would soon persuade foreign courts of their having more to apprehend from the power of the moral lever of which the first consul had acquired possession than they had at the time when the only object of those vested with authority before him was to destroy, or when the Directory in its vague and restless uneasiness could discover no means of security except in the ruin of ancient governments. It was an opinion generally prevalent in France that the war out of which she had just emerged had been undertaken by foreign powers only with a view to prevent the diffusion of republican principles, which the Directory had not relaxed in its endeavors to propagate ever since the peace of Campo Formio. The more prudent course pursued by the first consul, the moderation he had just displayed in victory, ought to have calmed the fears of the allies. Having no longer any reason to dread the fomenting of agitations amongst their subjects, it behooved them to show a similar spirit of moderation. The first consul himself was under a delusion on this subject. His confidence was heightened by knowing, as he did, how deeply he might have injured Austria after the Battle of Marengo. Still, if his moderation were not duly appreciated, he was justified in concluding that his power would take care not to incur the risk of again placing itself at his mercy. So great was the first consul's anxiety to reconcile the Republic with its enemies that he sought a renewal of negotiations wherever the door was not absolutely closed against them. Russia had brought no army into the field since the Battle of Zurich, and yet she was in a state of war with France. The Emperor Paul wielded the Russian scepter. It occurred to the first consul to collect all the soldiers of that monarch whom the fate of arms had thrown into our power. He had their national uniform restored to them, caused them to be armed and equipped anew, and sent them home. The Russian general, who was directed to lead them back to their country, merely received from him a letter to the autocrat, wherein he told him that as he felt no desire to wage war against his people, the gallant men who were thrown by chance into his power had no longer any prospect of being exchanged. In this state of things, he had determined to put an end to their captivity, entertaining full confidence in the Russian government. He had restored to them their arms, which on the score of bravery they had proved their claim to bear, and left them at liberty to wield those arms as their sovereign might think fit to direct. This noble and hitherto unexampled conduct had its desired effect. The Emperor Paul, who had declared war against an anarchical power, had no longer any motive for waging it against a government which proclaimed everywhere its respect for order, and only rendered its victories instrumental to securing peace. He accordingly dispatched Monsieur de Sprengporten to Paris without delay in order to return thanks to the First Consul for his generous action and to treat for peace, which was almost immediately concluded. This was the first of our friendly communications with foreign powers that was attended with complete success. The two countries had waged war against each other, but there existed no national animosity between them that could obstruct the way to a perfect reconciliation. The French consul adopted a peace establishment and brought the troops back to their garrisons, which they had not seen since 1792. All those gallant volunteers who had flown to arms when the country was in danger were now disbanded and sent home. Leave of absence was granted to such an extent that many corps were reduced to their skeletons, and even these were incomplete, the army having thus been placed upon a peace establishment. The First Consul withdrew the seals of the War Department from Monsieur Carnot and confided them to General Berthier. Chapter 21. The Peace of Luneville had been in the highest degree detrimental to the views of Mr. Pitt, then Prime Minister of England. He had openly declared that a war of extinction ought to be waged against France, and his last remaining ally had just withdrawn herself from his influence. He accordingly foresaw that unless he could again set a general coalition on foot, England would also be under the necessity of concluding a peace with the French Republic. Russia was governed by the Emperor Paul, who had manifested the intention of coming to terms with France, and the First Consul was not behindhand in this happy disposition, which soon led to a treaty of peace. Prussia was immovably bent upon the system of neutrality to which she had adhered ever since the Peace of Basel. Austria, after an unsuccessful struggle, had just laid down her arms. Spain was still wrapped up in her ancient habits and was quite devoted to France. The whole of Italy was in the power of the First Consul. Holland was bound to France by the ties of a policy and of a revolution that were common to both. The other petty powers of Germany were not then possessed of the military importance they have since acquired. In such a state of things, Mr. Pitt would be compelled to carry on the struggle single-handed. He accordingly retired from the ministry as soon as he found that it became a matter of necessity for England to conclude a peace. On quitting the helm, however, he caused Mr. Addington to be appointed his successor, the political sentiments of this minister being in accordance with his own. The names were changed, but their views and maxims were the same. Necessity was submitted to, a truce was concluded with the firm intention of suffering it to last no longer than the time requisite for renewing a general coalition against France, which inspired so much dread and was represented as the more dangerous to the common security of all, from her having confided to the First Consul the task of protecting the interests that had grown out of the Revolution. The Department of Foreign Affairs in France was held at this time by Monsieur de Talleyrand, a very intelligent man, no doubt, but who, on the present occasion, was entirely the dupe of his opponents and did not sustain the reputation of talent he had acquired. I have often heard the First Consul express his astonishment at never learning anything from his minister at the period of the rupture of the Peace of Amiens and of the coalition which soon followed it, especially when he found that the coalition had not been formed without the previous interference of a variety of private proceedings, of which his minister ought to have acquired a thorough knowledge. I now return to the overtures made by the new British ministry. Orders had been given by the preceding one to chase and capture fishing boats. This measure, which was only calculated to increase unnecessarily the evils of war, was contrary to all usage. Monsieur Otto intimated to the British cabinet that his presence could be no longer useful, that it behooved him to quit a country which abjured every sincere disposition to peace and disregarded and even violated the laws and usages of war. The measure he complained of was instantly revoked. Lord Hawkesbury informed him at the same time that the king was ready to renew the interrupted negotiations and willing to send a plenipotentiary minister to Paris. The first consul, whose intentions had not undergone any change, warmly hailed this overture, convinced, however, that a mere display of negotiations was not the most expeditious mode of settling a dispute which had only been rendered more complicated by a war of 8 years' duration. He proposed either to suspend hostilities at once or to decide immediately upon the preliminary articles of pacification. The British ministry agreed to the latter course, but endeavored to put forward all the pretensions to which they had publicly laid claim. They had acquired confidence from late occurrences in the north of Europe, the passage of the English fleet through the Sound, and the unexpected death of Paul. They proposed inadmissible conditions. The first consul rejected them and intimated to the British cabinet that although he desired peace, he would affix his signature to an honorable one only, resting upon an equitable balance in the several quarters of the globe, that he could not leave in the power of England those countries and possessions to which he laid claim, and which were of so much weight in the balance of Europe. He acknowledged at the same time that the extraordinary events which had occurred in Europe and the change which had taken place in the boundaries of the continental states might justify to a certain extent the pretensions advanced by the British government, but he was at a loss to understand upon what principle it could demand as its ultimatum to be allowed to retain Malta, Ceylon, all the countries wrested from Tipu Saib, Trinidad, Martinico, and other possessions. The French and Spanish armies had invaded Portugal. Its court, driven to extremity, offered to make the most painful sacrifices. The first consul, who, in the advantages which he had obtained over that kingdom, only sought means of compensation calculated to balance the restitution to be made by England to the allies of France, proposed to the British cabinet, in consenting to its arrangements respecting the East Indies, the adoption of the status antebellum for Portugal on the one side and for the Mediterranean and America on the other. Lord Hawkesbury rejected the proposal. He consented to give up Trinidad, but insisted upon retaining Malta, Martinico, Ceylon, Tobago, Demerara, Berbice, and Essequibo. These pretensions were at variance with the pacific professions so constantly put forth by the English ministers. The contradiction was pointed out to them. They replied, a feeling of acrimony crept into the discussion, and it was feared that such recriminations would dispel the hopes to which France still fondly clung. The first consul was determined, if possible, to avert so painful a result of his efforts. He resolved to fix anew the basis upon which the question was to rest, and specified the conditions he was prepared to agree to. Monsieur Otto's note was conceived in these terms: the undersigned has communicated to his government Lord Hawkesbury's note of the 20th July and is directed to return the following answer. The French government has at heart not to neglect any means calculated to bring about a general peace which is equally called for by humanity and by the interests of the Allied powers. It remains for the King of England to consider whether that peace is also consonant with his political, commercial, and national interests. In such a case, an island more or less remote cannot be a sufficient ground for prolonging the misfortunes of the world. The undersigned has made known by his last note how deeply the First Consul regretted the retrograde course which the negotiation had taken. But as Lord Hawkesbury disputes the fact in his note of the 20th July, the undersigned will now recapitulate the state of the question, which that frankness and precision which ought to always attend the discussion of matters of so much importance. The question is divided into 3 points: the Mediterranean, the East Indies, America. Egypt shall be restored to the port. The Republic of the Seven Islands is recognized. All the ports of the Adriatic and the Mediterranean that are occupied by French troops shall be given up to the Pope and the King of Naples. Mahon shall be returned to Spain. Malta shall be restored to the order. And if the King of England should deem it consistent with his interests as a preponderating naval sovereign to raise its fortifications, that clause will not be objected to. In India, England shall retain the island of Ceylon and thus become the unassailable sovereign of those rich and extensive countries. The other possessions, including the Cape of Good Hope, shall be restored to the Allies. In America, everything shall return to its former possessors. The King of England is already so powerful in that part of the globe that, being absolute master of India, he pretends to more. He must be aiming at the sovereignty of America. Portugal shall be maintained in all her integrity. Such are the conditions to which the French government is prepared to subscribe. They offer immense advantages to the British government. To aim at still greater would be to reject the tender. A just and mutually honorable peace. As Martinico was not conquered by British arms, but merely surrendered in trust by its inhabitants until France should have settled government, it cannot be considered as an English possession. France will never renounce her right to it. It now rests with the British cabinet to make known its determination. If these conditions do not meet its wishes, it will at least be proved to the whole world that the French consul has left no means untried, has shown a readiness to submit to every kind of sacrifice for the purpose of restoring peace and sparing humanity the tears and effusion of blood, which must be the unavoidable result of another campaign. Lord Hawkesbury's reply did not bear the stamp of that frankness that might have been expected. The minister, however, announced his sovereign's determination to retain only such portions of his conquest as were indispensable for guaranteeing his ancient possessions. With respect to Malta, the King of England was ready to enter into arrangements for the eventual disposal of that island and was seriously desiring of concerting the means by which Malta might be rendered wholly independent of Great Britain and France. The only difficulty that embarrassed the first part of the negotiation was thus removed. The second difficulty next came under consideration. It was pointed out to Lord Hawkesbury that the security of the ancient British possessions in America did not stand in need of the extension which it was thought necessary to give to them, since they had the island of Jamaica for their central point. This vast and opulent colony, strong by its natural position, had been fortified in a manner that secured it from any attack. Any attempt to preserve the recent acquisitions which England had made in America was tantamount to an endeavor to secure in the West Indies that absolute dominion which she already exercised in Oriental India. Lord Hawkesbury appeared to admit the truth of this reasoning and offered to restore Martinico, with the alternative, however, of retaining in the West Indies the islands of Trinidad and Tobago, and in such case of declaring Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice free ports, or of keeping possession of St. Lucia, Tobago, Demerara, Berbice, and Essequibo. This was a perplexing alternative. By giving up Trinidad, the first consul subjected Spain to a serious loss. By ceding Berbice, Essequibo, and Demerara, he made Holland bear all the weight of the sacrifices which a peace rendered necessary. On the other hand, he resigned to England the whole commerce of the American continent and inflicted upon Spain a much deeper wound that she could suffer by the abandonment of the island of Trinidad. The first consul would have willingly yielded Tobago in order to consult the interests of his allies. He even offered to add Curacao to it. England persisted in her demands, whilst he was, according to his own expression, unwilling to hazard the peace of the world by throwing it in the scale against the possession of an island which was divested of its former political importance, and he submitted to the sacrifice. Nothing more remained than to come to a definitive understanding with regard to Malta. Lord Hawkesbury evaded the question. He cavilled about terms. It was at last agreed upon, however, that the island should be given up to the order of St. John of Jerusalem, and that the evacuation should take place within the time agreed upon in Europe. For a measure of that description, the preliminaries of peace were ratified by both governments. Chapter 22. The administration was beginning to breathe. It was no longer necessary to impose sacrifices upon the nations or to draw upon the finances to meet extraordinary expenses. Nothing but reform and economy was talked of. A happy futurity opened everywhere to our view. A strange adventure suddenly occurred to throw a gloom over the picture. We were in the month of September when a deputy of the Senate, M. Clement de Ries, was carried away from an estate where he resided in the vicinity of Tours. A crowd of men had come to his house in disguise, compelled him to mount a horse, and forcibly conveyed him into the heart of a neighboring forest. Madame Clement de Ries had hurried off to Tours and, bathed in tears, had implored the prefect's assistance. The latter had made a report of the event, and as the peace of the country was threatened by this abduction, which might be the forerunner of some insurrection, the first consul ordered me to repair to the spot. I was not long in reaching Tours, where stupor was still marked on every countenance. No search had yet been made to discover Monsieur Clement de Ries. At the end of a few days, his wife received a communication stating that if she would deposit 50,000 francs in Blois or Amboise at a certain tavern which was named to her, she would recover her husband. This respectable lady did not hesitate a moment. She applied secretly to her friends, borrowed money from each, and succeeded in collecting the required sum. I had it intimated to her that she should provide the sum in silver money only. She proceeded on the journey with her treasure and repaired to the tavern pointed out. But on the first display made of the quantity of silver taken out of the carriage, a man came up and sharply told her, "Nothing can be done today. Go back. A letter will be written to you." So saying, he disappeared. She returned to Tours in the utmost despair, and with the impression that her husband had been murdered. I thought otherwise. I had ascertained that a country doctor, on going the round of his patients, had met the group by whom M. Clement de Ries had been carried off. Being also seized by the abductors, who feared his giving the alarm, he had traveled with the prisoner, was led to a spot where he was detained the whole night, and then dismissed with the necessary precautions to prevent his finding out the track they had pursued. On my sending for him, he particularly described the spot where he had fallen in with M. Clement de Ries, but as the abductors had immediately bandaged his eyes, he could give no clue to the road he had taken. All he could tell was that he had heard the clock of the village of Montrésor on his left striking the hour of 8. They soon afterwards reached the station, at which they dismounted. He had been conducted to a home which was entered by ascending 3 steps. The bandage was then removed from his eyes, and he was led to a chamber situated on the left of the entrance, where a pie, ham, and artichokes were set before him. After supper, a letter was handed to him for Madame Clement de Ries. He was again blindfolded, replaced on horseback, and led through 1,000 winding turns to the neighborhood of Montrésor, where he was set at liberty. The letter to which the doctor alluded was the identical one which Madame Clement de Ries had received. I had no other guide in my inquiries than the evidence of this lady, whose head was quite bewildered by the apprehension of the danger to which her husband was exposed and the information afforded by the doctor, who displayed great shrewdness. His disposition tallied with a fact I have not yet mentioned. A hat was picked up in the neighborhood of Miss Montrésor which was found to belong to Monsieur Clement de Brie. I questioned the doctor on this subject, and he replied that Monsieur Clement had in fact dropped his hat a short time before his arrival at the station, where they dismounted. The field of our inquiries thus became much circumscribed. We had only to search the vicinity of Montresor without proceeding beyond the distance within which the clock could be heard. I had assembled the brigade of gendarmerie stationed at Laux and Chinon. I now caused copies of the doctor's deposition to be distributed amongst them and directed them to search every one of the isolated houses, of which there was an abundance in this part of the country, and to extend their inquiries over a surface of 2 leagues. A quartermaster soon came to tell me that he was upon the right scent. He had found out a house which exactly tallied with all the circumstances mentioned in the doctor's deposition. He had entered it by ascending 3 steps and turned to the left into a room where he had noticed, near the steps of the staircase, some old artichoke leaves, which even appeared to have been there some time, as they were faded and half covered with dirt. Lastly, the remains of some ham had been served up to him. When not more than 10 days had elapsed after the disappearance of Monsieur Clement de Brie, this quartermaster had hastened back in all speed to relate these particulars. The Minister of Police, however, Monsieur Fouché, had already sent agents to the prefect. These men, who were formerly of the Vendéan party, had immediately opened a communication with the abductors of Monsieur Clement de Brie and reproached them with compromising those of their party whose only desire was to live in peace. They dwelt upon the deposition just made by the quartermaster of the gendarmerie and pointed out that their prey was about to escape from their grasp, and that consequently they were lost men. The abductors took the alarm, ran to the house in which Monsieur Clement de Brie was guarded, brought him out of the vault, led him blindfolded to a certain distance in the forest, and under pretense of a skirmish with some of their party just arrived from Paris, they fired a few pistol shots close to the ears of Monsieur Clement de Brie and disappeared amongst the trees. Those who next presented themselves appeared as the avengers of Monsieur Clement and hastened to inform him that he was free. The prisoner, quite beside himself with joy, tore the bandage from his eyes, embraced his deliverers, and re-entered Tours at the moment when everyone despaired of seeing him again. The public safety was compromised by this abduction. The first consul was inexorable towards the guilty. He insisted upon justice taking its course. The information obtained established the fact of the identity of the house pointed out by the quartermaster with that in which Monsieur Clement had been detained. In consequence of the account given of it by the prisoner, I sent to have it examined. The hole in which he had been detained was concealed under a heap of faggots in a shed close to the barn. Had it been of larger dimensions, it would probably have also become the little doctor's habitation. Monsieur Clement de Brie had remained concealed for 10 days in this hole, which only required to be stopped up in order to bury him alive, an event which would probably have come to pass had Madame Clement de Brie paid the sum which was demanded of her. Whilst the first consul's attention was directed to restoring the influence of the laws, he was not unmindful of Egypt. He had sent back in the month of September the aide-de-camp who had brought him the Convention of El Arish, and as he was informed of the consequences that had resulted from the non-execution of the treaty, he had apprised General Kleber by that officer of the period at which he would dispatch the relief which it was intended to afford him. He could only send it from Brest, and only harbor in which we had any ships of war. The directorial administration had carried their neglect so far as to permit the dismantling of the greater part of the squadron, which had been armed by Admiral Brie. Only 10 ships of the line were in a fit condition for sea. The Spanish fleet was still in Brest and would not have shared a better fate than our own had not the government of Charles IV taken upon itself to provide everything that was necessary for keeping it in proper repair. It therefore still presented a respectable appearance, whilst our fleet was reduced to a state of nullity. Ever since the month of September, the first consul had been considering the means of relieving Egypt. He had given orders to get ready for C6 of the best line of battleships belonging to the Brest fleet, to which were to be added 4 of the best frigates that could be found. He had caused them to be very carefully selected and fitted out without communicating to anyone the destination for which he intended them, and only waited for the long winter nights to order them to get under sail. In the meantime, 2,000 infantry, 200 cavalry, and 200 artillerymen had been assembling at Brest. The naval arsenal was preparing a considerable supply of arms, powder, melted lead, balls, shot, iron, copper, and other materials connected with an armament. The report had been spread of an expedition to St. Domingo, and all believed that these preparations were intended for the colony to which the convoy had been directed to proceed. I was desired by the first consul to proceed to Brest to superintend the execution of the orders he had given, and to deliver up his youngest brother Jerome Bonaparte to Admiral Gentilhomme, who commanded the squadron. It was at this period that Jerome first entered the navy. I was not to quit Brest until the admiral should have set sail. This did not happen for a long time. He was detained 2 months in port by contrary winds and by the presence of 2 English who were cruising off Ushant in the daily communication with the land. Those islanders still held the strings of that vast system of espionage which they had spread over those provinces at the period of the Civil War. It was impossible to keep from their knowledge the sailing of the smallest vessel without resorting to the most mysterious conduct. Gentilhomme's departure at last took place one evening during the prevalence of a high wind which almost threatened to blow the houses of Brest into the sea, and had forced away the British cruisers. No better moment could offer for sailing with the certainty of being neither seen nor pursued, because the English would not fail to return when the weather moderated. The advantage was therefore taken of it. The wind was very favorable, but our ships sailed in a tremendous storm, and all suffered very severe damage, which they had to repair in the open sea. Admiral Gentilhomme had foreseen the dispersion of his fleet, and had given to each captain secret written instructions, which he was only to open at sea, and in which he named Cap Finisterre as the first point of rendezvous. Afterwards, Cape St. Vincent, then the southern part of the island of Sardinia, and lastly Alexandria on the coast of Egypt. General Savary was still on shore when Gentilhomme's ships were weighing anchor to set sail. Mr. Caffarelli, the maritime prefect of Brest and brother of the officer who died in Syria, was urging him to embark, observing to him that the squadron would not wait his arrival on board. General Savary resisted and demanded for the use of his troops a considerable sum of money which the maritime prefect had not the power of giving to him, and which he moreover knew to be uncalled for, since he was in the secret of the destination of the squadron, which was not known to General Savary. The discussion was growing warm, and Savary was urging with great vehemence of language the interests of his expedition to St. Domingo, to which he thought he was proceeding. Mr. Caffarelli had in vain used every means in his power to persuade him to depart. The general was immovable, and declared he would not embark without his money. I was compelled to interfere in the discussion, and Monsieur Caffarelli and I both agreed upon the propriety of telling the truth to General Savary, who showed a momentary ill humor at what we unfolded, and went off without uttering a word. Gentilhomme had already been 40 hours at sea. No unpleasant event had occurred, nor did the English fleet make its appearance. I returned to Paris by way of Lorient and Nantes. I was at Brest when the crime of the 3rd Nivose was attempted. On my arrival in Paris, I found it still greatly agitated in consequence of the explosion of the infernal machine, and was enabled to collect the most minute details of that criminal attempt. There was to be that night at the opera first representation of Haydn's oratorio. The first consul was to attend. The conspirators concerted their measures accordingly. At this period, several of the houses in the carousel had already been demolished. Nevertheless, the angle of the Rue Saint-Nicaise still fronted the principal gate of the Hotel de Longueville, so that in going from the Tuileries to the theater it was necessary to turn first to the left and afterwards to the right to pass through the Rue Saint-Nicaise at once into the Rue de Malta. The consequence was that coachmen were obliged to slacken the pace of their horses to enable them to turn in the opposite direction. The conspirators had built their hopes of success upon the delays which these windings would necessarily occasion. The first consul left the Tuileries at the usual hour of representation. He was accompanied by General Lannes and I believe his aide-de-camp, Lebrun, with an escort consisting of a picket of grenadiers. In one moment he reached the angle where stood the cart upon which the infernal machine was laid. His coachman, a bold man, and a very dexterous driver who had been with him in Egypt, fortunately took it into his head to turn at once into the Rue de Malta instead of following the direct line of the Rue Saint-Nicaise. The carriage of the first consul was thus placed beyond danger. At that moment, the explosion took place. Killed or wounded about 40 people, sacrificed many victims, but missed the very one against whose life it was leveled. The glasses of his carriage only were broken, and the horse of the last trooper of the escort was wounded. The first consul arrived safe at the opera, where the report of the event had almost immediately become known. The police, taken by surprise, set every inquiry on foot, but whilst the researches were going on in different parties, and the state indulged in conjectures which displayed the intention of laying hold of any occurrence that might afford them an opportunity of injuring each other. The nobility insisted that the Jacobins were alone capable of such an attempt, that they alone had a design upon the life of the first consul, and that if the minister of police did not discover any trace of so infamous a conspiracy, it was for no other reason than its having been got up by his old accomplices. They urged in their own behalf the gratitude they owed to the protector of the state, who had put an end to their exile and reinstated them in their property. So far from making any attempt on his life, they were ready to shed their blood in its defense. In short, they pleaded their zeal and attachment with so much earnestness, and so beset Madame Bonaparte, who was of very easy access to them, that the first consul began to attach some credit to their accusations. This opinion was greatly strengthened by the representations of many of those who were about his person. They felt an abhorrence of the Jacobins, and did not fail to envenom the reports made against them. Many others bore a personal hatred to Fouché, and neglected no opportunity of injuring him. Clark, in particular, gave a loose to his animosity with a violence quite unaccountable to those who were ignorant of his old enmity to them. The first consul, on the other hand, was not over-satisfied with his minister. Another plot had been hatched against his life some time before, and not only the police had not given him any notice of it, but it was clearly proved to him that he would have been assassinated at the opera had it not been for the timely information of a noble-hearted man. The assassins were on that occasion seized in the lobby, where they had stationed themselves until he should quit his box, which at that time was in the first tier in front, between the two columns towards the left when facing the theater. His access to it was by the public entrance. In this attempt originated the idea of a private entrance, which ever after existed until the theater was pulled down. These were not the only two grounds of complaint which the first consul had against the administration of police. He complained of the disturbances in the western provinces, and was highly incensed at the depredations committing all over Brittany. audacity never gone to greater lengths. Not only were the diligences plundered of the taxes that had been collected, but those taxes were even forcibly seized in the chests of the collectors by bands of armed men. The public conveyances and couriers could not pass from one place to another without being attacked and plundered. Matters had come to such extremities that it had been found a necessity to place detachments of infantry on top of diligences, a precaution which did not always prove effectual. The lawless men who met together in this disgraceful pursuit were the terror of the country. They overran Paris, which delights in ridicule, only looked at the measures which had been adopted for repressing those excesses in a humorous point of view, and gave the names of armées impériales to the detachments with which the public conveyances were loaded. Envy, which works upon the slightest materials, laid hold of the most insignificant trifles for the purpose of injuring Monsieur Fouché. All the old stories of the police, whether true or false, that were current under the peaceable administration of Monsieur Lenoir were raked up and repeated, and the minister's character was tortured by comparisons of the most unfavorable nature. He was in a delicate situation. His dismissal was daily expected. The first consul was attended to every report, but he was not coming to a decision. He pretended to have adopted the conviction that the attempt upon his life was in reality the work of the Jacobin party against whom the general accusation was directed. On the other hand, many respectable people who were bound from principle to the revolution and who adhered to the consular government proposed that this opportunity should be laid hold of to act with severity against those restless minds which never grow weary of promoting disorders. This measure suggested, in their opinion, a double advantage. It had the effect of relieving society from certain elements of interminable discord and of eliciting whatever the party might have to reveal, supposing that the guilty were to be found in its ranks. It was Monsieur Fouché's impression that they lurked everywhere. But he had not courage to oppose the plan suggested, and he assisted in drawing up the list of those individuals who had taken a conspicuous part in the revolutionary excesses. They were arrested, conducted to Rochefort, and shipped off to Cayenne, without the least appeal being made in their favor by any of those of the minister's companions in the revolutionary career who had become reconciled to the first consul.